Welcome to the series What You Always Wanted to Ask. Today, we take up for a brief examination a question that many people have asked me in the past, namely, why is there included in the Ten Commandments the interdiction against taking the name of God, and particularly taking the name of God in vain? What does it mean to take the name of God in vain? These are questions that many people harbor in their minds, but very often they keep these questions to themselves, mainly because they believe that others will be irritated if such questions are raised with them. Therefore, I thought it would be a worthwhile thing for us to address such questions. Now, let's stay focused on this question. Why is it that it is very strongly prohibited to take the name of God in vain? Now, I'm sure many people have told you, or many people have said this before me, and that in Eastern cultures, name has a magical significance, and therefore, those who know the name of God may think that they can exercise control over God, and therefore, preventing people from invoking the name of God is one way of ensuring that people do not try and control God. Now, this certainly is an important aspect of it, because if you look at the psychology of human beings, you will know that every individual, big or small, high or low, rich or poor, makes no difference. Every human being has a tendency to control whatever a person can control. Now, in domestic life, a husband controls his wife, or father controls children, and nowadays children control their parents. In the congregational life, the priest controls the congregation, and if there are very affluent people in the congregation, they control the priest. Bishops control priests, and priests who know the weaknesses of bishops control them. Human relationships in this world are largely mediated through power and control. And that is because this tendency to exercise power over others is deeply ingrained in us. And we have an amazing insight into this in the 10th chapter of Mark's Gospel, from verse 25 onwards, where James and John, the sons of Zebedee, want Jesus to ensure for themselves places of preeminence on his right side and left hand side in his glorious second coming. And then, of course, Jesus uses an opportunity to teach them that in this world men love to lord over others, but it shall not be so with you. You have to overcome these perennial and universal human infirmities. So, therefore, let's be very clear on this. Basic to human nature is the tendency to control, to manipulate, to exercise dominion over everything, including God. Now, surely, if God is God, God has to be purely, utterly, absolutely sovereign. Sovereign means beyond the control of any other force or any other entity, including human beings. So one of the major problems in the domain of religion is that insofar as religion is the sphere in which there is proximity or closeness before God and human beings, there is always the risk that human beings would slip into the bad and ungodly or satanic psychology of exercising dominion over God. Instead of being led by the will of God, human beings would like to twist God around their wills, make God as an adjunct to their personal agenda or collective priorities, their parochial and sectarian interests, so on and so forth. To put it slightly differently, there are two possibilities in the domain of religion. One is that we belong to God, the other is that God belongs to us. Now, you might think that these are the same. These are exactly the opposite of each other. If God belongs to us, then it's a parochial God. It's our God. And our God cannot have anything to do with other gods or people of other gods. Okay? And that is precisely the nature that Christianity unfortunately has assumed. Christianity has become the the religion of our God. Whereas that was precisely what Jesus came to expose and reject. Jesus came to lead human beings from the narrow prison of this kind of possessive religiosity, parochial religiosity, which is very dangerous. Completely contrary to this is the idea that we belong to God. Now, if God belongs to us, we can control God and we can make God dance to our tune, and we can deny to God the freedom to do anything other than what we want Him to do. On the other hand, if we belong to God, then we cannot control God. Then God becomes much larger than us. And that God is free to include the whole of humanity within the ambit of His care, His compassion, His justice, His righteousness. And that God is also free to correct us, to reprove us, to chastise us, and also to make us go through very hard, demanding, sometimes scary experiences so that we spiritually evolve. When God becomes our private property, God becomes merely a tool of our convenience, which means that we never grow. Whereas if we belong to God, then God leads us along paths that are mysterious to our limited understanding, so that through that experience of being led along such paths, our understanding enlarges and our stature as spiritual beings grows. That's the beauty of this model of life. Now, the idea or the tendency or the need to take the name of God every now and then arises in the first model of religiosity that I mentioned, namely the terrible, tragic, and scary mistake by which we assume that God is our parochial property. God belongs to us. Our God, our God. Now, there is this expression in the Old Testament with which I completely disagree. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, that was the idea of God in the tribal times, the crude times, when a man's or a human being's imagination did not extend beyond the confines, the borders of a small village. And of course, the whole idea of life itself was organized along patriarchal lines. There was one patriarch who sat and presided over the entire clan, and therefore God dealt with the chieftain, and therefore God came to be imagined as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, etc. We don't know such a God. We know God as our Father in heaven. Everybody's Father in heaven. It's a tremendous leap in the understanding of God, and not only the understanding of God, of our relationship with God. So, this commandment that we should not take the name of God in vain is precisely to ensure that we do not slip into this terrible mistake of assuming that God is our parochial property. Number one. Number two. Now, this is extremely important, and what I'm going to now say has a little bit of psychological interest, and therefore those who have some background in psychology would understand this better. Now, if you look at human beings, I've always wondered, why is it that some people are more apt to respond to things godly, whereas others are not? Let me give you an example, because it's always better to think through examples in the interest of clarity. In the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, verses 16, 17, 18, we find Jesus walking along the shore of Galilee. There he meets with two brothers, Simon and his brother Andrew, without any introduction, without offering any incentive. Jesus says, "Follow me." And they leave everything and follow Jesus. Now, this has fascinated me. This has also challenged me. This has disturbed me and intrigued me. I've asked this question for months and months and months. What was it that made Simon and his brother Andrew to leave their livelihood? They have nothing else. Livelihood. to follow Jesus, who had absolutely no social address or political stature or economic might. He had nothing to offer. Now, the only way I can understand this, and this is something beautiful, the only way I can understand this is that in the mind of human beings, there are varying degrees of affinity to the idea of God. What is the idea of God? The idea of God is, in the case of human, I'm not saying that this is objectively valid. I'm saying that this is how human beings experience. The idea of God in the experience of human beings is that if you really examine yourself, there will be one overwhelming idea. Now, you may have denied it, you may not have dared to stand face to face with it, but there is one overwhelming idea. That idea is not the idea about becoming rich or becoming politically powerful or socially glamorous. No, that idea pertains to the very essence of life. Now, the power of that idea varies from individual to individual. In the case of some people, this idea lies deeply buried in their mind. In psychological terms, the subconscious mind. And in the case of many others, or at least a few others, this particular inner force, this particular overwhelming idea exists right at the top, waiting to be wakened, to be called out. And very likely, Simon and his brother Andrew were in that state. Uppermost in their inner life, there was this idea which they themselves, though it was very powerfully active within themselves, they did not understand what it was like. And here comes Jesus. And in a flash, the two are connected. That's the only way I can explain that beautiful but intriguing episode. So now, think of another parable that Jesus taught, the parable of the hidden treasures. A man came upon a hidden treasure. He went and sold all he had and he bought it. In other words, the meaning is very simple, that when we relate to God, we have to relate to God accepting God as the most overwhelming force, overwhelming reality, the ultimate treasure of our life. God cannot be accepted and should not be accepted like an ordinary transaction. You do this for me and I do this for you. That's how most people treat God in their religious life. This is an insult to the majesty of God. If God is to be related to at all, it has to be done in an absolute and overwhelming fashion. Now, when you relate to God, or when you experience God as an absolute and overwhelming reality, you cannot give a name to it. That is the most important thing I want to tell you. I hope those of you who are listening to me can understand the gravity of what I'm saying. Let me try to put it slightly differently so that this idea sinks into us. God is different from every other facet or mode of human existence in the sense that to everything else in the world we must relate in a relative manner. In other words, we should not absolutize anything in this world, neither money, nor possession, nor even relatives, no human being, nothing. Everything is relative. Relative to God. God alone is absolute. And as the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said, the absolute must be related to in an absolute manner. You cannot relate to the absolute in a relative manner, which is that's an insult to God. So either we relate to God as God must be related to, or we should not relate to God at all, which is more honest. To treat God as an object or a tool of one's convenience is the most perverse form of atheism, which people don't realize, and most people are guilty of the atheism of that kind. This overwhelming idea, this overwhelming experience, this overwhelming passion. It was this that erupted within Simon and his brother Andrew, which made them leave everything and follow Jesus. So, now in that kind of a state, when you experience God as an overwhelming reality, what name will you give that God? God becomes the unnameable. No name that human beings can invent matches God. Because every name is man's invention. Take it from me. There's no name which man has not invented. And no label, no man-made label can be stuck on God without corrupting, reducing, in fact destroying the majesty of God. And I believe this is the reason why the commandment says, and I'm in 100% agreement with it, do not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. But what is it that happens in the sphere of religion? The name of God is taken in vain day in and day out. Every form of deception, deviousness and falsehood is marketed and peddled in the name of God. And the kind of things that are done and showcased and made the substance of play acting is the most unbearable religious pain that every sensitive person has to endure. So the commandment makes eminent sense. If we take the name of God, you lose that holy fear which is basic to relating to God as God. The moment you begin to take the name of God, you limit God and you slip into the illusion that God is your private property or your parochial property. Secondly, insofar as you have the name of God in you, you get into this delusion that you can control God and limit God to your own narrow interests. And most of all, the moment you reduce God to a name, God ceases to be an overwhelming experience for you, which actually means that you've forfeited the very foundation of spirituality. God as God doesn't exist for you anymore. You've put yourself outside the pale, outside the remit, outside the boundaries of the true religious experience. And that is why in the book of Psalms we read God saying, "Be still and know that I am God." I conclude, do not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain.